right, good morning, everybody. My name's Kurt Steinke. Talk a little bit about dry beans, a little bit about sugar beets here this morning. So again, I am the soil fertility specialist at Michigan State. One of my graduate students, Storm Sote, is here. He's going to talk a little bit this morning about one of his sugar beet projects.
It is on. You won't hear a speaker, guys. That's just for the camera.
Thanks for checking, though. So we're going to talk a little bit about dry beans, a little bit about sugar beets. You know, one of the things we've been talking a lot about this summer and probably over the last year or so, and with everything going on around us, you know, there's a lot of what? Uncertainty, right? And, you know, you start talking about, you know, that two-word phrase that we've talked about, climate variability. Right? You've probably heard me talk about soil variability quite a bit, right? Horizontal variability, vertical variability. Soil variability creates what? Uncertainty. Climate variability also creates what? Uncertainty. We don't know what the weather's going to be, right? So when you look at April, May, and June, the last about 12, 13 years, all right, you had about 50% of those months are normal, 25% of those months are excessively wet, and 25% of those months are excessively dry. So what as a producer, or even agribusiness, what are you supposed to do? If you have about half a chance or 50% chance of being normal and equal chances of wet and dry, those are different management practices, completely different. And we're not talking wet versus dry of 4.5 inches versus 3 inches of rain. All right, we're talking wet versus dry, maybe 8 inches in April, May, and June, or 0 inches in April, May, or June, like we saw down by us this last growing season here in the springtime. So, uncertainty, right? A lot of uncertainty out there. So I got a little diagram here I'm going to throw out, or throw on the ground, more appropriately. All right, so we got a top number here. 0N with 3.4% organic matter, bottom number of 45 units of N, and 0.9% organic matter. If you were growing corn, what would yield more? That top number, 0N at 3.4% organic matter, or that bottom number, 45 units of N with 0.9% organic matter? And don't everybody speak at once. Any brave souls? I got one brave soul. Bottom. Heard another bottom? Bottom? Ha-ha. Yes. They are actually the same. So we just put out a publication with a group of investigators from about 10 different states looking at about 850 different site years of corn. And you know what we found? With those two parameters right there, they yield about the same. All right? So what does that tell us? Well, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? You can't necessarily rely on that high organic matter soil to supply all your nitrogen needs. Why? It might not mineralize in time, depending on your cropping system. Why might it not mineralize in time? Maybe it doesn't rain. Maybe it's too cold. Maybe it's too hot. Maybe it's too wet. We don't know, right? So how do we account for some of that uncertainty and some of that variability? That 5-word phrase that I've talked a lot about, if anybody on Zoom, which I know some of you have been, and I've been on Zoom way too much this last 12, 18 months, start right to finish well. Right? How can we start right to finish well? That's a little bit of where something like starter fertilizer can come into play. And why? It accounts for some of this variability. All right, any idea when you start talking about your N-responsive crops, okay, corn, dry bean, sugar beet, etc., you start talking about those N-responsive crops, any idea how much or what is the biggest factor and then what percentage is responsible for your uncertainty in your nitrogen rate and performance? So we talked about it's probably the weather, right? So the weather is typically the biggest factor that impacts your certainty in your N rate. But any idea what percent? So what percentage do you think the weather is primarily responsible for whether that N rate that you chose is correct, above optimum or below optimum. I think it's 25%, 50, 75, 100, somewhere in between. That's a good guess. It's actually about 75 to 89. 75 to 89% of that variability in your N rate is due to the weather. All right, and you don't have control over it, right? We don't know if it's wet, dry, hot, cold. So some of that variability is why, this is where we're all going to come back to dry beans now. You look at that, about 40 to 60 units of N in dry beans. That is why that number is typically there. It accounts for some of that variability that we see in spring. Look at what we've seen with regards to planting conditions, even the last 2 or 3 years. Okay, when you start talking about the first 3 weeks in June. All right, you go back 2 years ago, we had a really heavy rain right after planting. We saw a lot of crusting. We saw a lot of root disease issues. And we saw yields suffer 2 years ago. All right, you know, even on this farm here, we were probably 2,500 weight to the acre. Last year, what did we have? We had a much better seed bed. We had about 2 additional midsummer rains that were very timely. And what was the difference between 2019 and 2020? Instead of 22 to 2,500 weight, we were 40 to 4,500 weight. Same practices. All right, what did it depend on? The weather. All right. And so we've done some work on that the last couple of years with dry beans. So you start looking at that 40 to 60 units of N on dry beans. That's typically where a lot of our data still are at. And why is it there? Some of that weather variability to get that plant to start right to finish well. Now, when we go above that 60 units of N, what have we seen? We've seen a lot of biomass production. And yield has not followed. All right, we get those bushy beans. In some cases, you might get a little bit greater incidence of white mold, but we have not seen yield follow. Now, one of the other things we've looked at is what happens below ground. And we start looking at nodulation. We typically have not seen reductions in nodulation up to about 60 units of N. All right, and so, you know, take note of that. Above that, we tend to see a little bit of a reduction in that ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. The other thing to pay attention to is for those of you that are at a little higher N rate, typically what we've seen when you're above about 90 units of N on dry beans, you have enough residual N following dry beans to feed that ensuing wheat crop, for those of you that rotate wheat after dry beans. All right, so typically if you're above about 90, that residual nitrate after harvest tends to be sufficient enough that you may not need starter fertilizer on your wheat should you rotate wheat following dry beans. So that's a little bit of what we've worked on the last couple of years with regards to dry bean production. Keep in mind, you know, everything's going to be site specific, field specific, etc. One of the big things though, you just want to make sure you're not fertilizing for biomass over that overall yield. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit. Storm Soap, my graduate student right here, is going to talk a little bit about sugar beet production and a couple different attributes that he's looking at with regards to both early harvest and regular harvest with regards to sugar beets.
All right, thanks, Kurt. So, as Kurt said, my name is Storm, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the ways that we can aid in Michigan Sugar's slicing campaign, as well as the grower's bottom line. And the reasoning behind this is that we don't want to look at how we can grow more beets. We want to grow better beets. We don't want 45-ton beets with 8-10% sugar. We want to target about a 30-ton yield with 300 pounds per ton of extractable white sugar. Some of the ways that we can do this are looking at our harvest intervals with an early dig versus a normal timing. We know that digging early, we lose a little bit of tonnage. But there's some other incentives to getting them out, not mitigating your disease pressure, a little bit less of an N rate, etc. So the harvest timing comes into play. We have a variety difference, 2 varieties in this study, Crystal 919 and Crystal 675. And then among those, we have 4 fertility treatments. So with our Crystal 675, which is half of this study, we are looking at more of an offensive approach. Is they're a little bit higher in sugar, a little bit higher in tonnage, and they do not offer quite the disease package that the Crystal 919 does. That's more of a defensive variety in terms of taking care of some of your late season diseases. So looking at some of our fertility treatments, treatment 1 is 60 pounds of N in a 2x2, and that application is based on what we've seen with some of our early harvest, which is that between 40 and 60 units of N can get those beets through to this August timing. We're actually looking at digging the early side of this tomorrow, and what we're looking to see is hopefully that 60 pounder rate gets us through. And then we also have a treatment 2, which is a 60 pounds in the 2x2, as well as 100 pounds at side dress, which was that 4-leaf. And that's an approach that is more towards some of the later season beets to help those beets bulk up and take on that extra month and a half of growth. Treatment 3, we've got a liquid potash application along with our 60 pounds of N in the 2x2. That was a banded application right before row closure. And we went with this as we're looking at kind of potassium being the forgotten nutrient, in a sense that we know in other crops like corn and soybeans, it helps with stalk strength, vegetative growth, more synergistic uptake with our nitrogen, and anything that's going to impact that plant growth is going to impact how the root and the sugars develop. So the fourth treatment we've got is both the 60 units of N in the 2x2, as well as the side dressed, and the 100 units of liquid potash band applied. So again, looking at all of those across not only variety, but our harvest timings, and how that liquid potash can help transpire and relocate our nutrients. You can't have a plant that is negatively balanced. So K in the plant is a positive anion, and as nutrients are shunted to the root during bulking, we've got to keep the plant neutral. So if the liquid K got in and we were able to uptake, get a vegetative response, then we're looking at, can that response be, or can that equate to more tonnage, more sugar, etc. So, and then kind of as Dr. Steinke touched on with the climate resilience side of things, we don't know where growing beets is going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, but we know that 30 years ago it looked a lot different than it does today. So we need to come up with an approach that is more of an all-weather approach, and how can we keep plants, again, start right to finish well, whether it's with that 2x2, a band application of potash, or our harvest timings. But in the end, like I said in the beginning here, we're looking for that 30-ton yield with better beets, not necessarily more beets, which will help Michigan Sugar in terms of getting everything sliced in a timely fashion, and therefore keep growers rolling through the season. So, anything else, Kurt?
Things, Storm's really looking at too is, variety selection is so important, right? But do you treat an offensive variety, okay, something that has higher tonnage and probably higher sugar, the same as a defensive variety, something that might have a little bit more disease resistance? I don't know, right? They're going to react differently. And then you start throwing this early harvest versus regular harvest interval into it. What does early versus regular have on an offensive variety versus early versus regular on a defensive variety? We don't know. All right, so if you start thinking about, some of those maybe offensive varieties that have that good tonnage, that have that sugar, they don't tap into a lot of what we apply till about this point of the season and later. All right, which really impacts what we do early in the season. But with the same token, we know how much early season nutrient management can impact early season plant performance, and then that performance carries through to mid-season to capitalize on those mid-summer environmental conditions. All right, so it's not just early versus late, it's all comes together. The other thing that Storm's really taking a look at is potassium, right? What do we do with potassium? Because it's not just about your soil test concentration. All right. When you start talking about your soil test concentration, yes, that can help determine whether we see a yield response or lack of yield response. But one thing we really want to take a look at, is there anything that we can do, that we can apply perhaps mid-season before we get row closure, that can maybe help shunt those sugars from the leaf down to the root? All right, because nothing moves freely in a plant, right? You can't just move negative charges, can't just move positive charges. It has to be neutral. So if you start moving amino N down to the root, can we take some potassium with it to help balance that out and move more sugar down to the root? We don't know. So it's kind of a crapshoot what we're looking at with some of these treatments early in the season here, and we're probably going to look at see if we see a response, and can those responses then carry over to next year where we might be able to throw in a few extra treatments. So with that, we'll wrap up. If there are any questions, fantastic. We'll be around all day. Otherwise, we'll keep everybody on time. We can get everybody loaded up. I appreciate it.